Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome to the second day of Brussels Forum. And we have a fantastic program today with a lot of things, all day into the evening, actually. Just before we start, I wanted to make a quick, brief announcement. Congressional schedules being what they are, they've changed. So we have an opportunity actually to change around a little bit the program we have later this morning. And we're going to actually have an opportunity to talk about something that I'm sure you're all going to want to talk about, which is American politics looking towards 2020 and beyond, and how to decode it. And we've got great people to talk about that. So look forward to that later in the morning. Reflecting on the discussion yesterday and the theme of disruption, I think probably we would all agree that one of the major disruptive forces in the world today is the rise of China and its implications for the United States, for Europe, and for others. And one of the things we wanted to do with Brussels Forum this year is to have an opportunity to go into greater depth on some subjects. And one thing that we can do, because we have fantastic experts in the GMF orbit to talk about this, is to do exactly that. And I'm really very, very pleased that we have with us Andrew Small, a senior transatlantic fellow in our Washington office, who is going to come out and give us his thoughts on the rise of China and what it means for the West. So please, Andrew, welcome. We look forward to listening to you.
Thank you, Ian. Good morning. The future of the transatlantic relationship will increasingly depend on how we handle China. If we get this right, many areas of the transatlantic agenda that have stalled will be injected with new life. If we get it wrong, there are many areas of our existing security and economic cooperation that may come under threat. In both Europe and the US, the last couple of years have seen possibly the biggest rethink on China that we've seen since 1989, and possibly even since the opening of diplomatic relations. The US shift has been more visible, more dramatic in its immediate effects. What General Allen yesterday described as a bipolar, long-term generational battle. The elevation of China as a strategic competitor in the national security strategy and the national defense strategy. The launch of a trade war and escalating tariffs. And then more recently, we've seen a kind of translation of this into a technology war too, which will be far harder to throw into reverse, even if a trade agreement is reached. But the shifts in Europe have also been profound. Not so long ago, it would have been hard to imagine the European Commission labeling China a strategic, systemic competitor, systemic rival, and European heads of government happily signing it off. Indeed, a few years ago, the very notion of an EU investment screening mechanism was anathema. China was on track to be automatically granted market economy status. And reciprocity was kind of a dirty word, seen as barely veiled code for protectionism. Now, the EU has embarked on an overhaul not only of its approach to China, but a rethink of how all instruments of European policy need to be rebalanced in light of the China challenge. Not just trade, investment, maritime security, human rights, but competition policy, data, procurement, connectivity, industrial strategy, how the single market itself works. No longer is the question, how do we change China's behavior, but rather, what do we have to do differently on the assumption that China isn't changing anytime soon? How did we get here? One account has it that we've just been getting this horribly wrong for decades. There's a view that liberal optimism, liberal hubris led us to believe, first of all, that the more deeply China was integrated into the global trade and security order, the more deeply China would ingrain norms of market practices, multilateral habits. And secondly, that economic growth and the transformative power of the internet would gradually loosen the Chinese Communist Party's grip on power. From Uyghur detention camps in Xinjiang to the artificial islands in the South China Sea, Xi Jinping's deepening authoritarianism at home and assertiveness abroad has done a huge amount to strip away any remaining illusions in that regard. But many of these who thought that the Chinese Communist Party was here to stay still believed that Beijing would continue to see an interest in the kind of market reform and opening of the sort that we saw in the 1980s and before China's WTO accession that it pursued painfully at times, but successfully. Instead, not only has that stalled, leaving in place a whole array of non-market practices from forced technology transfers to industrial subsidies that China had promised would be eradicated when it joined the WTO by now. We've also seen a clawing back of control by the party over even the Chinese private sector, turning it more into China Inc. than it ever really was before in the post-Maoist era. If China had a much smaller economy, if its firms were only operating at the low end of the value chain, or if they were only competing in the Chinese market, we'd be dealing with a very different kind of problem. But we're now seeing this play out in fields that represent the very future of our economies. Not just steel and textiles, but electric vehicles, synthetic biology, high-speed rail, and the ripple effects in artificial intelligence across virtually every single industrial sector. With the Belt and Road Initiative and other Chinese outbound investments and loans and forms of finance, we're also seeing the externalization of virtually all the problematic Chinese domestic practices across virtually every region of the world. Not only is the Chinese market inaccessible in key sectors, but the same procurement practices, the same subsidies are hitting European and US firms in third markets and even in their home markets. It's also become harder and harder to avoid the fact that the security, technological, economic, and values issues are intertwined, from surveillance and big data to debt and dual-use ports. Indeed, the striking thing is that the biggest catalyst for change in European policy, and the very coinage of the term system competition rather than just economic competition, came not from human rights groups and not from the security community, but from business, and indeed a section of European business in the shape of Germany's BDI that had been one of the biggest beneficiaries of China's economic takeoff. Europe's commercial motivations about China supposedly precluded this form of thinking about strategic competition. Instead, today, they're one of the main forces driving it. Now, the fundamentals of this analysis, if not all of the nuances, are largely shared across the Atlantic. At the most basic level now, neither Europe nor the US believe that the kind of basic asymmetry that we've seen, that sees our system stay relatively open to China while China's system is relatively close to us, is sustainable anymore, politically or economically. Naturally enough, then, there have been calls to elevate cooperation on China in the transatlantic relationship, even to make it the next big transatlantic project. In the context of US-China policy and the transatlantic conversation, this is new. On GMF's Asia program, and we've been working on these issues now for the last 15 years, this is the first time that this has really ever loomed as large as it does today. In the old era of US-China competition, which was almost entirely focused on hard security in Asia, the countries that mattered were US treaty allies and the new security partners, such as India or Vietnam. When US policymakers thought about China, they rarely thought about Europe. European powers were in the second tier in East Asian security matters. Transatlantic cooperation in this area was seen as something nice to have if possible, but not anything we really needed to have. And China rarely featured in transatlantic summits or meetings among European and US leaders. That's changed. In the new era of competition, where access to technology, market size, regulatory power, infrastructure finance, development aid are the very heart of the contest with China, the EU, alongside Japan, is really the only other peer or near peer to the United States. Yet so far, although there have been some modest attempts at cooperation, this entire agenda has remained highly underdeveloped, pretty much restricted to the kind of firefighting that we've seen on 5G, limited coordination on trade measures, and some early, less publicly visible steps that we've seen on connectivity, countering Chinese influence operations, and investment screening. There are some very obvious reasons for these limitations, whether it be the wider political differences between the two sides, or on trade specifically, where it's hard for allies to cooperate as effectively when they're hitting each other or threatening each other with tariffs, or broader mistrust. There are certain risks that you're less willing to take when you think that your main partner may cut a deal behind your back. But these reasons are only really a part of it. As the US competition with China intensifies, Europe's current inclination is to strike a somewhat different balance. It doesn't want to give up on interdependence with China. It still wants to preserve major areas of cooperation. And more fundamentally, there's a different European view emerging when it comes to system openness. There's a push in the US at the moment to close down or restrict access for China in various sectors, not just through CFIUS, but research and technology partnerships, scientific cooperation. Europeans, even while looking to pare some of these things back from where they are today, don't want to move as far. Now, this partly reflects genuine differences. It partly reflects other important reasons. The fact that, aside from European uneasiness about new Cold Wars, for the US, Chinese access to advanced technologies is also a question of their impact on military capabilities and security competition. For Europe, for now, this is still largely a question of economics. And so far, unlike on, say, Russian or Iranian sanctions, where it was the European side that bore the main economic costs, in the emerging competition with China, the US economy and US firms have already been absorbing a hit, while Europe has been looking to maintain something that is, in effect, a pain-free China policy. The problem is that these aren't areas where we can just agree to disagree. If a high degree of alignment isn't achieved on everything from investment screening to 5G, there isn't just the potential for a US decoupling from China, which for some US policymakers would be okay. There's a risk that you end up with a partial transatlantic decoupling too. The relatively free flow of technologies, investment, capital, components, and other critical elements of the transatlantic economy cannot continue in the same way if one partner is substantially more open to China than the other. The effect in these circumstances would not just be a bifurcation, a Western-led economic order and a Chinese-led economic order, but fragmentation. We can't reach decisions about system openness separately. They have to be resolved together. And this doesn't only apply in the commercial sphere. China's involvement in Europe's digital and physical infrastructure will also have clear implications for transatlantic security cooperation and NATO. Information sharing, US forward deployments, mobilization capacity in a crisis. This is why reaching a deeper transatlantic agreement on China isn't just about marshalling forces on trade or shared values or a new security division of labor. It's also about making sure that we can continue to do the same things together that we do today. But this is only the starting point. The questions we should be asking are whether to compete effectively with China, to maintain our regulatory power, our technology edge, our military edge, and our economic competitiveness, we need deeper integration between the major economies and the major democratic allies. In trade and regulation, in data flows, in defense industrial cooperation. As the multilateral trade architecture comes under strain, how we can strengthen the plurilateral alternatives. And whether we're really collectively geared up now to win out in the battle for norms that's already underway across much of the developing world with China, and even in the EU's own neighborhood, in the Western Balkans and elsewhere. In the digital sphere, in democracy, in infrastructure and development, is our offer now as strong as it needs to be? We've seen some moves of this sort outside the transatlantic context, such as CPTPP, or the Japan-EU FTA, and the Data Adequacy Agreement, building the world's largest area of safe data flows. But whether it be public disquiet in Europe about TTIP, wariness in Congress about ratifying trade deals, or the gaps in our views on data privacy, the transatlantic cooperation in these agendas was seriously lagging or stalled even before many of our current disagreements intensified. And this is now clearly a far more difficult time for these kind of architecture-building questions, to say the least, given the current state of our transatlantic relationship and the state of a debate in Europe that's being pushed more and more into thinking about strategic autonomy. But this can be or should be reframed by China, where the underlying challenges that we're going to face are only going to grow more acute. Will we reach the point where we decide that the genuine and legitimate differences that we have with each other on so many of these issues are less salient than the differences that we have with the Chinese party state? Can we revisit the broader transatlantic agenda, not just China policy as such, but a readjustment of our overall priorities to take into account the fact that Chinese economic, military, technological, even ideological power is going to be a far more central issue to deal with in the years ahead? And how quickly will we come to recognize that failure to align our overall approaches could damage the transatlantic security alliance and our mutual economic openness? If we allow these difficult choices to drift for too long, fail to pull together and get stuck on the defensive agenda against China, instead of mutually strengthening our collective capacities, there's a real risk that we weaken ourselves in the competition, not just for economic interests or military advantage, but beyond that, over who gets to write the rules and norms that govern people's everyday lives across the world in the decades to come. The good news is that by the time that we get to the end of the Brussels Forum discussions today on trade, economics, and technology, I'm sure we'll have reached all of the right answers to these questions. Thank you very much.